So this is this is a story from this book, and this book is a book of true stories. So normally, before this, I wrote novels, but I got really interested in real life, and I thought so much for a novelist, so much of life is wasted. Because there's so much you could be writing about, but if it doesn't fit into your novel, you can't use it. So I thought it would really be good to sort of use all the parts of the buffalo and to just write true stories. So this is one, it's called Irvin in Wonderland, and it's about my father in the hospital. So I don't think I have to explain anything beforehand. So, okay. I went to Oklahoma City to see my father. This was after he'd woken up from his coma but was still in the hospital. The elevator doors glided open on his floor, and his wife was standing there on the other side in a bright yellow pantsuit. I was never sure, whenever we met, how she'd treat me. For years, I could barely get a good morning out of her. She was the sort of person who could come into a room and say good morning to everyone but one person, and that person was usually me. Lately, she warmed up a bit, I have no idea why, and now, as we encountered each other across the undulating threshold of the elevator, she seemed happy, even relieved to see me, although relieved in the military sense is probably the correct word. As soon as I arrived for hospital duty, she abandoned the post, and though I spent almost every hour in my father's room for the next week and a half, I never saw her again during my stay. I was surprised by her friendliness and the rush of enthusiasm in her voice. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, leading me to a small sitting area not far from the bank of elevators. "I have no idea what to do with your father." "Really?" I said. "What's the matter?" She huffed out a short breath. "Well, he's been having visions." "Visions?" "Or hallucinations, or I don't know what all, and he's been saying the oddest things." "Yeah, what kind of things?" "Well, he's been seeing, I don't know, but animals moving through the walls, and he wants to know if they're real or not, and I just don't know what to tell him." "Come here," my father said when I entered the room. He was lying in his hospital bed in a gown. "No, here," he said, with an intensity I wasn't used to meeting in his gaze. "Sit right across from me." Extending his arm, he reached for my hand, "so that we can talk panim el panim." Panim el panim. Now, this was weird in 1,000 different ways. To begin with, my father wasn't an overtly religious man. His life centered on business, on golf, on his membership in the Masonic Temple. He had not, to my knowledge, ever delved into the Torah, nor had he lived in a community whose members delved into the Torah. Even his rabbi, I'm certain, had probably never delved too deeply into the Torah, nor, I'm sure of this, had my father ever spoken a word of conversational Hebrew in his life. In the Reform synagogue of my childhood, even the Shema, the affirmation of God's oneness, was recited in English. And yet here he was, addressing me in the Hebrew of the Bible, quoting Exodus 33:11 to be exact, and the Holy One spoke to Moses face to face, panim el panim, as one man speaks to another. Weirder still was hearing my father do so in his thick West Texas accent. Its vowels bent out of shape like nails yanked out of a piece of wood. Panim al panim. Dad's stay in the hospital lasted exactly 60 days. Oddly enough, he'd been admitted on Tish B'Av, perhaps the darkest day on the Hebrew calendar, a day of wailing and mourning, commemorating the destruction of the ancient temple in Jerusalem, and he would be released the day after Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. According to mystical tradition, this period is freighted with meaning. Between the black fast of Tisha B'Av and the white fast of Yom Kippur, introspection and repentance are the order of the day. Dad grasped my hands and pulled me closer to him. There were some things he wished to discuss with me, he said, family things and the like, this bad blood between me and his wife, etc., etc. And as we talked, holding on to each other's hands, our conversation slid down many other avenues, and he began to obsess over why he'd been given, as he put it, this extra time. This seemed an odd way of thinking to me. We're given whatever we're given, Dad. Why would you think of any of it as extra? But no, he seemed convinced of it. And as though one thing had to do with the other, he sat up on the side of his bed and began telling me about his recent experiences. The Shriners had taken me to New York, to a hotel in New York, he said, and they'd brought along this girl, a girl I was supposed to marry. A girl? I said. He nodded. It had all been arranged. Okay. And what I don't understand is, yeah, did I dream it? Am I remembering it? Or did it actually happen? He scratched his scalp through the coils of his gray-black hair, and we were quiet for a moment. I was by this time sitting next to him on the bed, massaging his shoulders and his neck, something he loved for me to do. And did you know this woman, Dad? He shook his head, his wide neck moving beneath my hand. I mean, did you recognize her? I'd never seen her before in my life, he exclaimed, sounding as though the woman in question had accused him of a crime. And what was the feeling of the experience? He cocked his ear towards me. The feeling? Yeah. What do you mean, the feeling? Yeah, I mean, what did it feel like? Really good, he said, having thought about it, having thought it over. It felt really good. This had been after he'd gone into his coma, after the machines he was attached to in the ICU went kablooey, after the code blue had been sounded and the chaplain in her boxy skirt set had come into his room and asked if she could sit with us. I had that afternoon filled out a do not resuscitate order for him. My brother and sisters had stood around his bed, and as his elder son, I had recited Vidui, the deathbed confession on his behalf. Later, as he lingered in the coma, I'd sit near his bed and look into his face, which at times, there's no other way to describe it, seemed to be radiating light. I told him all this as we sat together now on his hospital bed. I know a bit about Jewish mysticism, about the Mysterium Conjunctionis between Tiferet and Malchut in the Garden of Pomegranates, the divine marriage between the male and the female halves of the cosmos. And I suggested to my father, clearly now in an altered state, that perhaps at some point during his coma, his soul might have been elsewhere than firmly locked within the prison house of his body, stretched as it were to the ends of its elastic, and that the wedding his fellow Shriners made for him might have actually occurred, although in a place with fewer than 4 dimensions. This was not the kind of conversation I usually had with my father, and yet against all expectations, the answer seemed to satisfy him. His restless probing of the incident ceased, and he seemed pleased not to have to dismiss his dream bride as a figment of his imagination. We spent days together with him in this state. It lasted the entire time I was there. Later, a nurse told me that thanks to the deficiencies in his kidney function, the lip balm they'd given him for a fever blister had caused him to hallucinate. At the time, though, all I knew was that he seemed to have dropped a very potent tab of acid. Lying in his bed, he'd see things flying through the walls. Fliegel, he'd say. little wings in Yiddish, giggling like a child and nodding at me with a sort of conspiratorial nod. Hurricane Katrina was on its way, and with newscasts unspooling endlessly into his room through the TV mounted on the wall, Dad became preoccupied with the story. One day, looking troubled, he said to me, "Now, if we can't live on the land, and if we can't live in the sea, then where are we going to live?" Before I could address this mad concern, a nurse entered the room, an African woman whose coal-black face seemed radiant and glowing. I thought Dad might lose his train of thought amid all the nursely commotion, but the question seemed too vital for him, too pressing. "I know, we can all live in hyperspace." He grinned at me, lit up like the Cheshire Cat. I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't know what to say. This was not the father I remembered, the father who spent his mornings in retirement selling stock options, the father who, in a foreign city, preferred sitting in his hotel room to walking the streets, a man with no patience for philosophical speculations. That my father might use a word like hyperspace seemed as strange to me as had his speaking in Hebrew. "Do you see?" he said to me now, lowering his voice. "See what, Dad?" "Look," he whispered urgently. "Okay, Dad, but what am I looking at?" I said, whispering as well. "At the nurse," he said, lowering his voice even further, gesturing discreetly towards her with his chin. "Okay, yeah? Isn't it obvious?" he said. "Isn't what obvious, Dad?" "That she's been swimming in hyperspace." I looked at the nurse, and perhaps because of her tranquil expression and her graceful presence, and the calm with which she seemed to be taking in the world around her, I sort of understood. No, I understood exactly what my father meant. By this time, I had verses of the Song of Songs rolling through my head. Turn back, O Shulamit, that we may gaze upon you. Ever the gentleman, Dad pulled me closer. "You don't think I've offended her by saying that, do you?" I looked at the nurse again, at her face as radiant and tranquil as the night sky. "No, I don't think so, Dad." "Good," he nodded, reassured. Days passed, and though I admit I enjoyed my father's company in this state, we had never, in fact, gotten along so well. The experience was exhausting. It was like keeping up with a brilliant child who, obsessed with the subtleties of quantum physics, refuses to take a nap. "Take a note," he said one day, rocketing up straight in his hospital bed, the tails of his gown flying. I grabbed my notepad and my pen. "This is for the will." We had agreed before I arrived that together we'd write his ethical will, a document for subsequent generations. At last he seemed ready to begin. "I sired Israel," he exclaimed, dictating to me. 12 tribes, and a portion for each tribe, and a double portion for Ethan, my brother, being gay. Naturally, I was concerned for his well-being. What were these hallucinations? How worried should I be about them? Were they part of some larger medical issue? And so periodically, although a bit reluctantly, we'd never had so much fun together, I'd call in a nurse, and acting the concerned son, I'd say, "See here now, I think my father here, well, I think he might be hallucinating." "Hallucinating?" The nurse, whoever she was, and there were many of them during the course of my stay, said each time, and always it seemed to me with an unwarranted dose of skepticism, "I think so, yeah, a little bit, I mean." Each time the nurse leaned over my father's bed, she put her face into his, and in a High Plains accent, with vowels as wide as open barn doors, she'd shout, "Mr. Skibell, who's the President of the United States?" Dad would tell her, and then she'd say, And do you know what day it is today? None of the nurses seemed to mind that. Before answering this question, Dad always turned and checked the digital calendar clock hanging on the wall near his bed, but I suppose it seemed a rational thing to do. And do you know where you are? Sometimes Dad would make a complicated Texas joke, telling the nurse that he was in Plainview. Plainview being a small town outside of Lubbock, meaning, of course, that he was right in front of her. But since he wasn't in Lubbock, but in Oklahoma City, I'd have to explain the joke, a joke that indicated that perhaps Dad didn't actually know where he was after all, a point that seemed to get lost in the tangle of humor. And then the nurse would always turn to me and shrugs, "Same's all right to me." "You're listening to the heart of the Republican Party," Dad told one nurse when she'd placed a stethoscope on his chest. "Is that right?" "Yes, ma'am." "Seems all right to me," the nurse said, shrugging, the stethoscope still in her ears. This time, though, when the nurse shrugged and said, "Seems all right to me," I told her, yeah, well, okay, he can answer all those questions, although he did look at the calendar clock for the second one. "But you see that nurse right there?" I pointed towards the beautiful Shulamit, who had, in the meantime, come back into our room. "Well, a moment ago, my father told me that he could tell that she had been swimming in hyperspace, okay?" The nurse took this in. "In hyperspace?" "In hyperspace," I said, "yes." "Did he?" she asked her dark-skinned colleague. My word alone was insufficiently credible, it seemed. The beautiful nurse nodded, affirming my statement, her face as tranquil as ever. "Ah, well then," the nurse said, "I guess we better do something about it then." It took days for Dad to come off his high. Days and nights during which we continued our Irvin and Wonderland explorations of consciousness and meaning. "Did a rabbi come in with you yesterday?" he asked me at one point. "No, Dad, why?" "Oh, well, I thought I saw a little guy in a black suit and a black beard in the doorway right after you arrived." Another mystical vision, I assumed. But a day later, a man fitting that exact description entered our room, introducing himself not as a rabbi, but as a minister, another one of the hospital chaplains. He and my father began chatting away like old friends. Dad was always good with people, and when Dad learned that the chaplain, though born in Honduras, had been to seminary in Germany, he began speaking German with him, more or less fluently, it seemed to me, which was odd because I'd never heard my father speaking German before. It makes you wonder, how much of ourselves do we really know? How much of ourselves do we hide, even from ourselves, behind the masks we wear? The lip balm had cleansed the doors of perception for my father, but which was the real man? The stern, straight-laced paterfamilias I'd known my entire life, or the cosmic cowboy, this blissful rider of the purple haze, tumbling along with the tumbling tumbleweeds of ecstatic consciousness, through the fragrant bowers of the Garden of Pomegranates to a hotel in New York City where, radiant as a bride on her wedding day, his soul was trembling in anticipation of his arrival. "What am I doing?" Dad said once into the phone when his brother Richard called him. "Joseph and I are talking about things that you could never understand because you're just too much of a dipstick." The truth is, he hadn't been the easiest of fathers. I was always a little bit afraid of him when I was a kid. He had an unpredictable temper, and you never knew when you might set him off and find yourself the object of his wrath. At 6'2", he towered over us, and when he was angry, he'd set upon you with all the fury of an indignant prosecutor, his voice a booming, aggrieved growl. As an adolescent, my very presence seemed to irritate him. My hair was too long, my politics too liberal, my ambitions too unworldly. As I grew older, he seemed to place himself between me and everything that mattered to me. There were some very bad moments between us which we never discussed or resolved, and as a consequence of this, or who knows why, we never really developed a sense of intimacy. I never learned to speak truthfully to him. I never felt at ease in his presence, and whenever we were together, we tended to hide from each other behind our careful masks. And so I was grateful that Dad's visionary trip coincided with my visit. And I was probably the only member of the family who could have entered into this alternate universe with him enrolled. My sister Cindy, for instance, coming on duty not long after I left, overheard Dad on the phone describing to a cousin how he'd come to be in the hospital. "It's the strangest thing," he said. "I was standing in front of a dual-prop plane when one of the propellers somehow lopped off my leg." Cindy went immediately to his bedside, and pulling back his covers, she demonstrated to him the irrefutable evidence of his two legs lying visibly intact before him. "Damn," was all he could say. Cindy told me, "I'd been wondering why at physical therapy that morning he kept saying to his therapist, 'Not bad for a one-legged man.'" The psilocybinic lip balm had somehow liberated us both. The polite, wary distance between us seemed to collapse in on itself. Dad seemed funny and free, and for the first time we seemed to be speaking a common language. For the first time we seemed to be speaking to each other face to face, panim el panim, and for a while, even after the nurses resolved the issue and prescribed the lip balm, this increased sense of intimacy, this deeper knowing of each other continued. It resonated in our long-distance phone calls where the affection between us was palpable in a way it had never been. "When are you coming back?" Dad said whenever I phoned. "I really want to see you again." But then, of course, time passed. The garden of pomegranates receded into the distance. The little winged creatures stopped flying through the walls. The air no longer crackled with verses from the Song of Songs. Katrina devastated New Orleans, and no one sought refuge in hyperspace. The German and Hebrew words fell out of Dad's conversation. His missing leg returned. He forgot all about the wedding in New York. The 60 days between Tish B'Av and Yom Kippur fell off the calendar like leaves falling off a tree, and Dad, released from the hospital, returned to his normal state of consciousness. Out of long habit, our old masks were restored. He and I returned to our old guarded positions, and the next time I saw him, we were distant and correct with each other once again. Thank you.
The night before. Yeah, no, it's